Hello and welcome to our webinar. My name is David Rosenbaum. I'm a professor of economics here at the Department of Economics at UNL, and I'm also the Associate Director of the Bureau of Business Research in the College of Business. We're going to be talking about work lives and occupations today, but before I get started, a couple of reminders. There's a chat box on the side of your screen if you want to chat with other participants during the webinar. And there's another box for Q&A. If you'd like to write in some questions, I'll be answering those at the end of the webinar. So let's get rolling. The issue or the topic we're going to talk about today is work lives and whether work lives vary for workers in more sedentary jobs versus less sedentary jobs. I can't get that. There we go. All right, so what does a work life measure? It measures the number of years that someone of a certain age will work over their remaining lifetime. So for example, a 40-year-old female with a college degree may work 21 more years over her remaining work life or lifetime, and a 40-year-old male with less than a high school education may work only 17 more years over his remaining lifetime. And this work life accounts for either voluntary or involuntary exits from the labor market. So you either decide to leave a job or you get laid off and you're not going to search for a job for a while. And it also accounts for the probability that people may die. And we're going to ask a few questions. The first one, definitional. How are work lives calculated? Then we'll ask, do they vary by the physical demands of the occupation? Do they vary for men and women? Do they vary by education? Here's our first question. How are work lives calculated? At any age, you can think of a person as being in three potential labor market categories. They can be inactive, which means they're not employed and they're not unemployed. And unemployed are those who are actively looking for work. The other is you can be active in a more physically demanding job, or you can be active in a less physically demanding job. Those are the three labor market categories that we think about. From one age to the next then, so think of someone going from age 40 to 41, for example, a person can either stay in the same category, they can switch into another category, or we allow for the probability that they could die. Then at each age, you get 1 year of work life if you start and end in one of the two active categories. So for example, if someone at age 40 is active in a more physically demanding job, and at age 41 they're active in a more physically demanding job, they get 1 year of work life. You get a half a year of work life if you either start in the inactive category and end in one of the active categories, or you start in an active category and the next year you're inactive, or you start in an active category and by the next year you die. And then at each age, a person gets no years of work life if they start inactive and the next year they remain inactive, or they switch from inactive to death. And as you might expect, once you die, you get no more additional years of work life. Now we can estimate the probabilities of making these switches from one age to the next using current population survey data. And the current population survey surveys tens of thousands of Americans each year, and they ask several questions, among them, what's your age, what's your sex, what's your education, and what's your job market status. And we can link observations from one year to the next year to see your employment status in the first year and the second year. And that allows us to know whether you're active or inactive, and if you're active, if you're in a more physically demanding occupation or a less physically demanding occupation. We can do that over all ages, and then we can add the years of work life together. So here's a little notation that's going to make the rest of the presentation a little easier. An I stands for the inactive category. And again, inactive are people who are not employed and they're not looking for work. So the unemployed are considered active. M would be someone who's active in a more physically demanding occupation. L would be someone who's active in a less physically demanding occupation. And to determine those, it's kind of interesting. We use that CPS data, and it asks for each person what your occupation is. And then we can link that to another database that shows us for occupations the relative physical demands of the occupation. They rate those on a scale from 1 to 100. So we can take the ones that are ranked from 1 to 50 and call those the less physically demanding, and the ones from 51 to 100 call those the more physically demanding. So here's an interesting view of a breakdown on the probabilities of starting in one state and ending in another state. So on the left-hand side of the screen, for example, we have information for men. And that information for men is broken into 3 categories. So you see the I to I, that's the probability that at 1 year you're inactive and the next year you're inactive as well. Looking at that data, it's broken down even further. The LTHS would be men with less than a high school degree. The BA would be men with a bachelor's degree. So it's interesting to note that looking across all of those ages, if you start inactive, there's a very high probability that the next year you're going to remain inactive. For a 40-year-old male, for example, with less than a high school degree, there's an 81% chance that if you're inactive at age 40, you're going to be inactive at age 41. You can see those probabilities are slightly lower for men with bachelor's degrees, but they're still pretty high. The next set of columns with a circle around them would be the probability of switching from the inactive state to a less physically demanding job. Now look at those. For men with less than a high school degree, there's a 4% or less chance that they're going to go from inactive to a sedentary type of job. On the other hand, for men with a bachelor's degree, the probability of them leaving inactive and going to a less physically demanding job is much higher. You can see at 40 years old, it's about 23%. At 25, there's a 1 in 3 chance that a man with a bachelor's degree is going to go from inactive to a less physically demanding job. And the next column shows going from inactive to more physically demanding jobs. And it switches. Men with less than a high school degree have a much higher probability of going to more physically demanding jobs than men with a bachelor's degree. And you get similar results on the right-hand side for women. Putting all of that together then, so our next slide shows the probability of switching, given you're starting in a less physically demanding occupation, a sedentary type of occupation. Now look at those results for men who switch from less demanding and remain in less demanding. Those are the columns that are in that circle. If you've got a bachelor's degree, look at that bachelor's degree 35-year-old. There's a 90% chance that if that 35-year-old male with a bachelor's degree was in a more sedentary job, he's going to be in a more sedentary job in the next year. You can see those probabilities are very high for men with bachelor's degrees. On the other hand, for men with less than a high school degree, if they start in a less physically demanding job, there's basically less than a 50% chance they're going to be in a less physically demanding job the next year. The next column shows switching from a less physically demanding job to a more physically demanding job. And again, look at the variation by education. Take a man who's 40 years old. If he's in a less physically demanding job, there's almost a 50% chance he's going to jump to a more physically demanding job by the next year. On the other hand, a man with a bachelor's degree, there's a 10% chance that at age 40, if he's in a less physically demanding job, by age 41, he's going to be in a more physically demanding job. And again, you get similar types of results for women. Finally, let's look at those starting in more physically demanding jobs. Again, for men, in that first circled column, if you got less than a high school degree, there's about a 5% chance that if you're starting in a more physically demanding job, you're going to switch to a less physically demanding job. On the other hand, men who start in more physically demanding jobs tend to remain in those more physically demanding jobs, whether they have a less than high school degree or a bachelor's degree. And you see the same type of result for women. But the interesting thing is, those different switching probabilities don't mean different work lives, because whether you're in a less physically demanding job or a more physically demanding job, in either case, you're active in the labor market, and so you get another year of work life. Let me show you what that looks like. Here's a table, and again, on the right-hand side, we've got men, and this is switching. The first two columns show men with less than high school degrees. The very first column shows men who start in less physically demanding jobs, but in the next year, they're still working in some kind of a job. You can see those probabilities are very high, and they're very similar to men who start in a more physically demanding job, but in the next year are still working in some kind of job. And the same is true for men with bachelors, for women with less than high school, and women with bachelors. So what that says is there's very different probabilities of moving from the less physically demanding jobs to the more physically demanding jobs by education. But these people are still working. And so what you get are work lives that are very similar. So these are work lives for people with less than high school degrees. And again, on the right-hand side, we have men. And we can look at men who start either inactive, start in a less physically demanding job, or start in a more physically demanding job. And we can look at their work lives by age. Two interesting things. Look at the 40-year-old man. If he's inactive, he's going to have 13.43 more years of work over his remaining lifetime. That's lower than men who start in one of the active states. But whether you've got a physically brutal job or an office job, you can see those work lives are almost identical. So for that 40-year-old man, the one who starts in a less physically demanding job has about 17.75 years of work life. The one who starts in a more physically demanding job has 17.46 years, almost identical. And you can see they're very similar at almost every age. And looking for women, we find the same result again. Those who are inactive have shorter work lives. Those who start in either active states have very similar work lives. So what that says is people who are in physically demanding jobs, they don't leave the labor market, or they don't work any fewer years than people who are in less physically demanding jobs. And we can look at some additional results. So these are work lives by college education, or for those with a college education. And you see, again, a very similar pattern. If you're inactive, you've got a shorter work life. If you're in either of the active states, you're going to have very similar work life, whether you're in a physically demanding job or you're in a fairly sedentary job. Now, comparing that to the previous table, you can see that men and women with less than high school degrees have shorter work lives regardless of their labor market state than men and women with college degrees. So what we find is that you get equal work lives for those in less and more physically demanding occupations for a given sex, age, and education. It just doesn't seem to matter. Inactive men and women have shorter work lives than their active counterparts. The least educated have the shortest work lives. They're either voluntarily or involuntarily out of the labor market much more often than those with higher education. And work life increases uniformly with education. I've just shown you less than high school and college degrees here, but we've also done this analysis for people with high school degrees, those with some college, those with associate degrees, those with professional degrees. And you see as the level of education increases, the work life increases as well. Work lives by sex. Men generally have longer work lives than women. This is especially true for those with less education. And interestingly, work lives, for those with college degrees, work lives tend to equalize later in their lives. And our thinking there is, at younger ages, women are more likely to leave the labor market, at least temporarily, to raise young children than men are. And that's going to have an impact on their work life at those younger ages. Well, we cruised through that pretty quickly. I will, at this point, we'll take any Q&A that might be out there. Yeah, I don't see any questions coming up. Our next webinar is March 29th, and we'll be talking about what's hot and what's not business expectations in Nebraska industries. And in case you need to get in touch with us, here's contact information about the BBR. We're on LinkedIn and Facebook and Twitter, and you can subscribe to our newsletter by sending your preferred email address to the address below. Thank you for your time, and we appreciate your watching.